in Aruni Kashyap, who's sitting at the end. I'll introduce them. There'll be some readings. We'll talk among ourselves and we'll throw it open to questions. At the end, there'll be a short clip of a film I'm working on. The title of this theme is actually taken from my first book on the Northeast, which was Strangers of the Mist. Strangers in the Mist, so I don't quite know what the difference is. I'd like to introduce the panel. Dr. Temsula, former Dean of the Department of English at NEHU, now enjoying retired life of writing for the last few weeks back in Nagaland. Mamang, author of several books on Arunachal, novels and poems, been translated into Spanish. Mr. P.C. Sharma, who's from the Assam cadre of the IAS. He is currently with the National Human Rights Commission in Delhi, which has sponsored this event. And Aruni Kashyap, a new young novelist from Assam, whose book, novel The House with 1,000 Novels, is to be published soon. He teaches in Guwahati right now. Let me start because I was not supposed to be chairing, but since I prepared a reading, I'll start with a reading from my first book on Strangers of the Mist. Some years ago, I used the phrase 1,000 years in a lifetime to express the breakneck speed at which political, economic, and social developments has swamped the Northeast and its people in the past half a century. I am reminded of this during visits where people speak of the terrific pace of events and feel despair at not being able to control them. The Northeast is a magnificent and tragic tapestry of people, events, and nature. You can be touched by its rivers, rain, and mist, overwhelmed by the seeming gentleness of its people, and stirred by its powerful and evocative history. There is strength and fragility in its immense diversity. There are not less than 220 ethnic groups in the 8 states comprising the region, with a population of about 40 million. There are communities with kin in neighboring countries. 4 countries abut on the region, which juts out of the mainland of India towards Myanmar, with long borders with China, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. Indeed, 96% of its land borders are with these nations. A bare 4% is with India. Is it surprising, therefore, that people in community there feel alienated and very distant, not just from Delhi, but the rest of the country? There are many truths here, conflicting realities, especially in terms of perceptions. And indeed, it is these differing perceptions, as much as other issues, that lie at the root of most conflicts in the region, between India and its perceived Northeast, as well as within the Northeast itself. This is Asia in miniature, where the brown and yellow races meet and mingle, where communities and oral history span national boundaries as seamlessly as the mountains and the forests which run across them. The only land connection with India is a narrow corridor, the chicken's neck, through which natural and finished goods such as oil, gas, and tea flow outwards, and consumer goods, food, and other essential and non-essential items come into the Northeast. There are sensitive and complex problems that have defied solution for as long as independent India has existed. Our population, about 3% of the national figure, is just above 1/4 of that of Bangladesh. Its peoples are an anthropologist's delight and an administrator's nightmare. A political settlement in a district that satisfies one group will alienate a handful of communities in another part of the same district, not to speak of the state. There are special laws, constitutional provisions such as the 6th Schedule and 371A, which seek to protect the tradition, lands, and rights of various hill and plain communities. In fact, in some areas, as a result of such protection, no land can be bought by a non-tribal, even if he or she should live there. There can be no alienation of land. That's just really to to place the setting, because this is going to be what I hope will be a very political set of readings and conversations. I don't know how comfortable Mr. Sharma is with that, but he has to also deal with it. But Mr. Sharma, sorry, Mr. Meena, I'm sorry, Mr. Meena of the IS. So we'll ask Temsula to read from our very evocative and powerful book, These Hills Called Home, which was the theme of yesterday's session. Temsula.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Speaking to the mic.
As an introduction to the set of stories that were published under the title These Hills Called Home, and also to make those people who have never been to the Northeast and have very little knowledge about the area, what these strangers of the mist are. I'm reading from the preface to my book. Many of the stories in this collection have their genesis in the turbulent years of bloodshed and tears that make up the history of the Nagas from the early 50s of the last century, and their demand from independence from the Indian state. But while the actual struggle remains a backdrop, the thrust of the narratives is to probe how the events of that era have restructured or even revolutionized the Naga psyche. It was as though a great cataclysmic upheaval threw up many realities for the Nagas, within which they are still struggling to settle for a legitimate identity. It was almost like a birth by fire. While some remain untouched by the flames, many others got transformed into beings almost unrecognizable even to themselves. Nagaland's story of the struggle for self-determination started with high idealism and romantic notions of fervent nationalism, but it somehow got rewritten into one of disappointment and disillusionment because it became the very thing it sought to overcome. Now, what happens to the people as a result of these confrontations? I'll read excerpts from two of my stories, short passages. The first one is from a story called The Old Man Remembers. He's talking to his grandson after the funeral of his very good friend and colleagues in the underground. Listen carefully, young one, the grandfather said, because this is the first and the last time that I shall speak about these things. They have given me nothing but pain all these years, and therefore I did not want anyone to know about them, especially you. But now I realize that my friend, your grandfather Imli, the one who was just buried, was right. I should tell you these stories because only then will young people like you understand what has wounded our souls. We too were young and carefree like you once, but all of a sudden our youth was snatched away from us. And instead of school books, we were carrying guns and other weapons of destruction and living in the jungle like wild creatures. I still remember how everything changed for me and my friend Imli. It was the last day of school in December before the Christmas holidays, and all of us were excited. Nobody paid any attention to what the teacher was saying. We were talking loudly to each other about our plans for the holidays. Imli and I had made plenty of pellets for our catapults and were looking forward to camping out in our farmhouses away from the village and shooting down the birds that come there in great flocks to eat the leftover grain after harvest. Of course, you know that this is the time when the birds taste best. And as we made our plans, our mouths watered at the prospect of eating the succulent meat. But it was not to be. Even as the last peal of the school bell was dying away, we heard a great roar of women and children shrieking and crying and trying to run away from the balls of fire which seemed to be chasing them. All the school children rushed out, and we saw the most horrifying sight of our lives. At that time of day, as you know, the only people left in the village are children, nursing mothers, old people who can no longer go to the fields, and a few village sentries. It was these helpless ones that the gun-toting soldiers were picking out easily and shooting like animals running away from a forest fire. One village sentry was running towards the school shouting at the top of his voice, "Run to the jungle, run to the jungle." We were paralyzed with fear and shock and simply stood where we were. But he kept on shouting, and from the smoke, running and shouting, his voice now gone hoarse from shouting, and from the smoke he inhaled with every word. At last our teacher took up the cry and instructed us to scatter in different directions towards the jungle, telling us to go as far as we could go before nightfall. He added, "Stay together in small groups and do not make a noise or light any fire wherever you may be. We will come for you in the morning. Now run, run for your lives." That is how an insurgent was born. This is from the old man. An old man remembers.
Thank you, Temsula. Mamang, you wish to read?
Thank you, Sanjay. Arunachal Pradesh is considered a very peaceful state in the northeast, but there has been in the last decade and a few years before that a kind of spillover. We don't have a separatist movement or homegrown insurgency groups, but there has been a spillover inevitably from neighboring states of Assam, Nagaland, you know, the ongoing movements that are there. And now our eastern districts of Tirap and Changlang, bordering Myanmar and Nagaland, have become rather violent places. Not much is known about it because it has been reported in the media, but there is a kind of silence. People are not talking. And this is actually a sign of surrender. People have given up, villagers have given up, they have lost faith. And I think basically the question of troubles is one of governance, the role of the state police, and also the civil administration. Without a starting point of empathy, I feel there can be no administration. So I would just like to read two poems, if I may, with the permission of the chair, which is my response to the developments in Arunachal Pradesh. I would read, and this one is called Remembrance. Why did we think it was trivial that it would rain every summer, that nights would be still with sleep, and that the green fern would uncurl ceaselessly by the roadside? Why did we think survival was simple, that river and field would stand forever, invulnerable even to the dreams of strangers? For we knew where the sun lay resting in the folded silence of the hills. This summer it rains more than ever. The footfall of soldiers is drowned and scattered. In the hidden exchange of news we hear that weapons are multiplying in the forest. The jungle is a big eater, hiding terror in the carnivorous green. Why did we think that ritual gods would survive, deathless in memory, in trees and stones and the sleep of babies? Now when we close our eyes and cease to believe, God dies. For as long as remembrance, men stared at fire and water. We dwell in the mountains and do not know what the world hears about us. Foragers for a destiny, all the days of our lives we stare at the outline of the hills, lifting our eyes to the invincible sky. Now what I feel is people, thank you, people caught in conflict situations, it's a kind of, especially with women, they have no one to turn to. So sometimes I think maybe our village elders have a better way. They can just wait it out. They don't need to speak to the law enforcement agencies, the paramilitary, nor deal with the insurgents in a kind of violent way. They just let things pass up and down through their village. But this also requires a great deal of wisdom, I think, to be able to tolerate this kind of situation. And this is what is happening. I must also say, because Arunachal has no industries, there's a kind of growing feeling among people today that, with all the funds pouring in from the center and so much being spent for elections, but again, we have very small constituencies, so the local politician can actually pay for everyone and maintain the status quo that way, So until we reach that kind of critical mass, I think people in the villages are just letting it go over their heads. So I don't know if people who come and we try to provoke them into saying something, if that is the better way, or which is the better way. But this is my final poem is called "The Sorrow of Women." They are talking about hunger. They are saying there is an unquenchable fire burning in our hearts. My love, what shall I do? I am thinking how I may lose you to war and big issues more important than me. Life is so hard like this. Nobody knows why. It is like fire. It is like rainwater, sand, glass. What shall I do, my love, if my reflection disappears? They are talking about a place where rice flows on the streets, about a place where there is gold in the leaves of trees. They are talking about displacement when the opium poppy was growing, dizzy in the sun, happy in a state of believing. And they are talking about escape, about liberty, men and guns. Ah, the urgency for survival. But what will they do, not knowing the sorrow of women?
Ms. Meena, you want to come in now and briefly speak about what you want?
Let me introduce, I am J.P. Meena, representing National Human Rights Commission of India. We have sponsored this session thinking that this is a platform which can take the message of human rights to the larger population, and we must utilize this opportunity, and that's why I am here. I am not belonging to the tribes which is sitting here, but I have served 27 years in Northeast. I belong to this part of country. I would take this opportunity to say some of my experience. Mr. Sanjay Hazarika's book describe the situation of Northeast and the problem which lies there very authentically, and those who want to know about Northeast must read it. When I went 27 years back to Northeast, I found it's a wonderful land. It is still is. Very often we talk of mainstreaming Northeast, but I say it very proudly that the mainland need to be mainstream with the culture of Northeast. There is no social evil which we see in the mainland. There is no casteage, there is no untouchability, there is no discrimination between boy and girl. Both are loved the same way by their parents and the society. But of late there have been problems which is a cause of concern, and there are genuine reasons to that problem, and those are attended to be genuinely by the people who take decision. Terrorism, we do feel, is due to lack of development. It's a cause and effect. Because there is a terrorism, the officers hesitate to go to serve in remote areas. The people do not get essential services, medical services, drinking water supplies, electricity. The industries do not come, they hesitate to, and as a result, the avenues of employments are not enough for the young lords. They easily are lured away by these groups, and many of them have made it a means of collecting easy money. This in all affects human rights of common man badly. In the name of controlling terrorism, there are excesses but committed by the police and administration. In the name of terrorism, people are deprived of essential services, remote areas are not connected, and the government services are not reaching there. The terrorists also have killed many innocent civilians. They have destroyed schools, hospital buildings, so that security forces do not come and stay there. This further has deprived the common man there of availing the services of the state and meeting the basic needs of health and drinking water and education. I would not like to say much because it's a different setting, but I wanted to put my message across that the writers and the such literary festivals can become very important stage for spreading human rights and sending message to the government to do something urgently and appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to hear a government official being prepared to criticize the government, although one would say that perhaps the issues in the Northeast and many other parts of the country are not due to lack of development, but because the state has failed in reaching the political aspirations of people, and from that there have been a bunch of other issues which have come up, including insurgency and the growth of violence. I would like to just read from a work in progress of mine. I'm planning to complete this book later this year on the region and its neighborhood. And this section is about impunity in the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. I write non-fiction, I can't write fiction. And the truth is very often much uglier and much more violent than fiction can portray. And the AFSPA, as it is briefly called, has been a critical source of confrontation between people and the state. And the reason behind extensive human rights violations, which Mr. Sharma referred to since '58, it's of course a live issue in Kashmir, but I don't want to go into that. The army came to Benrui village on the high ridge of the hills in Peren district, Nagaland, after a brief mortar attack in which a young mother and the child she was nursing were blown to bits. Every man, woman and child, barring an old man, fled into the jungle. The harvest remained uncut. The women would stealthily slip down to the stream at night, babies strapped to their backs to collect water. No fires would be lit to cook rice, vegetables or meat out of fear of alerting the soldiers. The granary bins of every home in Benrui, vegetables, pots and furniture were destroyed by occupying forces. Only when the fear had abated after weeks did the villagers return to their homes. They faced beatings and harassment whenever the forces came in search of insurgents and their contacts to that spectacular, strategic, windswept village, which commands the heights on four sides, and where thick green jungle, washed by spring rains, covers the plunging hillsides. There was, however, one saving grace, in the form of a Captain Dorairaj of the Garhwal Rifles, who reached the village before forces from 3 other army units rushed the heights. Dorairaj, to his lasting credit, refused to allow the village to be burnt, and had many others in the Naga Hills. That was 55 years ago, and that was the Indian Army which went in to control the first armed revolt against the idea of India in the hills of Assam. Benrui had been held by the Naga villagers and was the last in that district to fall to the army. They were lucky. Many other villages were razed, residents killed, women raped. It's a long, painful history of which we should be ashamed. But to understand why this idea of separation from India remains so attractive for so many in Nagaland and other parts of the Northeast, it's important to listen to their stories of grief, their songs of sorrow, and to realize with horror that for decades here and in countless villages of this state, of Assam, of Mizoram and Manipur, where the conflict has been sharpest, few have come from anywhere in India to listen. There has been no counseling to enable them to cope with their trauma and the nightmares which still haunt their waking and sleeping hours. In over 50 years, we are among the few independent groups to come to Benrui. Down in the hills, in the plains of my home state of Assam, in the village of Bokota, villagers shared tea, home-brewed rice, and swapped stories. We trudged from home to home in the slippery mud under rain and darkness, the sounds of a million bullfrogs and cicadas filling the air. Fireflies zigzag the incandescent dance, and each story fills me with anger. This is part of what was Ulfa country. Ulfa is the United Liberation Front of Assam, where hundreds of recruits joined the organization in the 1980s and 90s, seeking a simplistic liberation of their motherland from colonial Indian forces, distressed by the economic backwardness and the political indifference of Delhi and Dispur. In one home, a father and mother mourned the death of a beloved son, picked up and beaten in front of them, and thrown into an army truck while a horrified neighborhood watched helplessly. That nightmare lasted much of the 1990s, but even today, sometimes victims wait in fear. This is the other definitive side of the nature of the state, of the power of impunity, where there is no concern about impacts. It is not just conducting an operation, but the effects of those actions which remain embedded in the minds and spirits of people for decades afterwards. There is no recompense, no information as to how people can get justice, no effort to reach out and heal. AFSA is a skeletal act. 6 clauses, of which 2 are the worst. One that empowers army personnel to open fire to the extent of killing a person on suspicion, apart from detention, searches, destroying homes, suspected armed dumps, and camps without warrants. And the last clause, which protects soldiers from prosecution without the sanction of the central government. In 53 years, this sanction has not been given. The army must return to barracks and AFSA, under which all these acts of violence have been sanctioned for over 50 years, must be repealed. I was a member of a committee set up by the Prime Minister some years ago, which called unanimously for its revocation because it has become an object of hate and suspicion. The government of India has not had the courage to implement it, and the army has been totally determined to block it. A cabinet note on extensive amendments has not even been introduced into a cabinet meeting for over a year. But why do you need this any longer? And I argue that in the Northeast, if you look at today's situation, the insurgencies are winding down. There's public fatigue. Every major insurgent group is either in talks with the government or the leaders are in jail. And the actions of Bhutan and Bangladesh in terms of military action against groups and detentions have been more effective than India's military operations and the sweeping powers that AFSA endowed on the military for over half a century. The India of today is no longer that of the 1950s, when it was uncertain of its stability and direction, unable to respond to separatist or secessionist tendencies except with an armed fist. Today, there is greater dialogue, there is greater confidence in dialogue. So what's the case for AFSA? The army is supposed to protect our borders, and the sooner it gets back to doing that job, the better. The climate of impunity is flourishing, and it cannot be allowed to do so unhindered, and undeterred by the silence of the state administration or the arrogance of the powerful who wield guns in or out of uniform. There is an example, the Punjab police, which rode roughshod over rights and held sway with power over life and death for thousands in fake encounters during the years of Sikh militancy and KPS Gill's Raj, are being called to account, with the officers in jail are being prosecuted for willful violations of law. The Army's generals call AFSA the Bible of anti-insurgency operations, that even changing it, not to speak of repeat, will tie their hands. But as long as AFSA and those protected by it continue, so will the atmosphere of impunity endure. So will forced migration, for even though conditions have improved and are improving, who would want to live the rest of their lives under such conditions, interrupted by a whimsical gesture that demeans, an arrogant blow or act that makes people reel with pain and fear, or the capriciousness that makes them disappear? Aruni Kashyap, young new novelist, will talk about his book.
Thank you, Sanjay, for giving me a chance to speak here. I'm very humble amongst you all, actually. Well, my novel is called The House of the Thousand Novels. It is set against a very advanced stage of the Assamese separatist insurgency, and I have been asked to speak a little bit about it. one major way how the Indian government actually breaks down secessionist movements in India is actually by co-opting a specific class of elites. And the secret killings of Assam that happened in the late 90s was a result of this specific kind of co-opting. And how they do this is by, in the early 90s, most of the major insurgent leaders of the Assamese separatist movement were asked to surrender, forced to surrender. If they didn't surrender, they were killed extrajudicially. And when a lot of them surrendered on the, when they received a lot of money, exorbitant amounts of money were sanctioned for them, and with the tag called, they were brought to the mainstream. So this class of people came to be known as the Salfa, surrendered alpha militants, and they started apparently helping out a lot of government officials in finding the hideouts of the underground ones. So what happened was that it's always debatable and controversial who started the killings at first, but to force the rebels to surrender, a lot of people were the alpha members were targeted, and in the second stage, the alpha members started targeting Salfa members, and then each of their families started getting targeted. So my story is not a historical retelling of that phase, but what had happened actually in my ancestral village during that time. My father belongs to, he grew up in a village, and though I have grown up in a city, so he always insisted that we should maintain strong ties with our ancestral village, with our grandparents. So I spent almost all my vacations there, and there I have seen the real picture of how people were reeling under the separatist movement. I have seen how people are suffering, but at the same time, I have also seen the sheen of resilience of people who were beaten up, who were maimed because they had helped the insurgents in a certain other way. And often it's very complicated situation. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, the rebels will come and they will demand for food, and you would have to give it to them. And there was a period of time in the late 80s and early 90s when people actually took pride if one of their family members was a separatist militant. This changed gradually because of brutal insurgency operations. So the secret killings is the stage against which my novel is set, and like I have written very less. Whatever stories I have written, mostly I have dealt with the insurgency of my state, and it is almost an unconscious choice, because that is what affected me most. That is what interested me most since childhood, and I remember during a very late stage of the secret killings, a person called Juti Kharma was killed near my house. He had around, I think, 6 daughters, and he was the only earning member of the family. And I had my test there, school test. I was waiting for the school bus, and there was a spontaneous procession in Guwahati, and people were shutting the shops because it had, towards the late 90s, we used to wake up with some of the other kind of killing happening in some part of Assam, and or one of the other family being massacred completely by masked gunmen. They were picked up. They used to come and just shoot, and so maybe that's why this insurgency always intrudes into my fiction. Whatever poems I have written, whatever little number of stories I have written, and my first novel also dealt with this. And so this is. I was talking to a person, a senior novelist from Assam, English novelist, and a few days ago before coming here, and she said we were talking about the insurgency, and she said, your generation don't know what it means to live without the shadow of the gun, and maybe that's why you continually talk only about the violence in Assam. And but at the same time, I do worry that whether I'm actually perpetuating a very violent picture of Assam or not. I think so I think I would like to conclude by saying that being a writer in Assam, growing up in an oppressive regime, is actually a very, very difficult job, because I'm constantly trying to think how I can free myself from the fetters of this oppression, from the fetters of these violent events that has surrounded me and my generation's life, that we don't even know what it meant to live without the shadow of the gun, without regular bomb blast and killings. And but actually there are better stories than than the violent stories, and I wish I could tell them, but since it impresses upon us so much, maybe that's why I talk about it most. That's all. Yeah, thank you so much for giving me a chance.
Thank you. I think that that whole, I think through all our conversations and what we've said, the process of resilience and resistance, these two go very strongly together in our region, certainly. Now, you've heard from us, and we'd really like to hear from you. And if you have questions, we have a few minutes for questions. But please, as I said yesterday, ask a question, make it short. If you want to make a comment, make it short. Otherwise, I'll have to be rude and interrupt you. Thank you. We'll start from here.
Yes, Sanjay, you mentioned something in your opening comments about the prohibitions on alienation of land in the Northeast. We've seen these in all states which are considered to have special circumstances. Kashmir most notably, but also Himachal Pradesh, because it was a new state, which was only 30 years ago, and Uttarakhand, which was a 10-year-old state. Could you outline some of your thoughts behind how that process could have been better handled, and your understanding of why it was put in place?
I think the concept was that certain communities needed protection from other larger majoritarian groups which were far more organized, better educated, had far sharper business set, and could just overwhelm them in terms both of numbers as well as their economy, and virtually destroy their living conditions, exploit them. And this did happen in some areas. But in the process, you are having a situation where even if somebody wishes to invest, say money, he has to go not to the government, but in some of these places to the villages and get support from the chiefs and the village heads and the village council, so that the land is given for a process of setting up an industry and so on. It's quite complex, and I think that should have been seen a bit further down the line. I think the other thing is that there is, for instance, the state of Nagaland, where Temsula is from, there is a constitutional clause which means that no law passed by parliament is applicable to that state unless it is approved by the state assembly. And the government of India has no right over the natural resources, whether it's land, whether it's oil or forests or whatever, unless it gets support from the local village council in clearing a project. So those are there, but haven't all been implemented very well. I think the key problem, apart from conception, has also been implementation. Some of these things do need to change. It's become a gravy train on which everybody makes money. That's part of the problem.
Lots of hands.
Yeah. Somebody from the back. Yeah, okay. We'll go to the back now and then come back forward. At the back. Can you ask the question? Ask the question. I'll repeat it. Oh, okay. We'll go to you after that. Yeah, ask the question.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to convey the tragedy of the types of situations that you people are exposed to. And I wanted to encourage the poets and the writers who are expressing the human side of these types of situations, because they're increasingly common in our corporatized state. I just wanted to know what inspiration, if any inspiration, you take from Hezbollah, because that is a political movement that is rooted in the families, that is deeply organized and motivated by real offense at human rights abuses.
Thank you. How much inspiration do these organizations or whatever have from Hezbollah? The party as well, Lebanon and so on.
No, I don't have the faintest. Not Hezbollah.
I don't think there's really much inspiration from there. These are very homegrown insurgencies. In fact, the Naga insurgency drew its inspiration from Mao. And there was a long march from Nagaland to Yunnan by 100 men in 66 that led to the shaping of the first insurgency with international training. Can you just pass the mic around because there are lots of questions and we we're coming back in front. And there's a lady at the back, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
just one question regarding, it was mentioned about resilience and resistance amongst the population, and I've also read quite widely that Manipur is a failed state, and amongst the youth, because of the despair, the situation of endemic drug use that's taken place and other adverse consequences amongst the youth. Would you like to comment about the adverse effects that this has had amongst the youth in the northeast?
Aruni?
I can speak about Assam. In Assam, we have to first remember that there is a very strong divide between the urban population and the rural population. In cities like Guwahati and all, most people are not really concerned about what is going on in the villages. Probably that's the biggest success of Indian democracy, that they have been able to create this breed of people, this bunch of people who are not much concerned except a few. But the people who are in the villages are still suffering, and the youth. And when you come to Assam, it's a very complex situation. There's rampant unemployment because of the lack of industries and lack of development, because of insurgency, and again insurgency started because of the lack of development, because they're demanding rights. So I'm not sure about the drug use part, but maybe in other states of Northeast. But in Assam, a lot of people, a lot of young men and women, men especially, they either joined one of the 40 insurgent groups. There are 39 insurgent groups in Assam, and joined, or they are just staying at home, unemployed, not very focused with their lives. That could be the reason that could be one of the features of what we're looking for.
I would also like to add to that, and also to take in the lady's kind question just now about empathy. As you have very correctly said, we were talking about the resilience of the people of the Northeast. And this, I think, today the change is that the resilience and the moral stamina applies to people in the villages. The rural migration that has been taking, coming out of the villages and coming to the urban centers, the newly urban and political centers of the state, has really created havoc among our youth, I think. There is no employment, and most people, we have been brought up in that fashion that a government job is best, it's most secure. But there are no government jobs. There's also the question of skill and merit, which they never had the opportunity before they came to the district centers. And the government, I feel, is not applying its mind properly to this problem. We have a very big drug problem in eastern Arunachal. It's also coming in all across now. Easy access is there. The main centers are actually in UP and Tinsukia. It's not coming via Manipur and what we think of as the Golden Triangle, which we are very close to. It's being sold in all the little pawn shops, the gumtis, and young people are actually stealing, out of the rice bin. They're selling utensils, and they're running away from home. They're even chipping the little concrete blocks in the park to get at the metal rod, and they can sell that to a scrap dealer. And this is the kind of situation mothers have been trying to organize, especially in Lohit district. They go out at night and they sit under the, I think it's really tragic, under the changhar, They hide underneath because their children are above and busy smoking and doing this kind of thing. But in the absence of, again, rehabilitation centers and proper counseling, it's a kind of losing battle, Many children have died, OD'd and died in the state and out of the state. But parents are also not willing to admit to this as yet. They say, he was ill or something happened, death came just like that. So that is something we have to get over also. Thank you.
We have time. Really, we don't have time. So you'll have to talk to us afterwards. I'm very thankful to all of you for being so interested and attentive.
There's a lady who wanted
I know she wanted to ask a question, but you'll have to. I'm afraid we have just one thing that we want to close with. I have a 40-second shot of a documentary I'm finishing on the impact of conflict on women in Nagaland and Assam. And basically, it starts with this woman in a Naga village who's talking about the husband she lost many years ago, and basically saying that if only we got a chance to bury him, our spirits and his spirits would have been healed. Is it playing? I mean, we loaded it. Is there any? It's not coming. No, it was. It's coming, but too much, right? Anyway, so this is one of the things that technology, we propose and technology disposes. So the idea is that this is a film we will be finishing later this year, and hopefully by next year we'll be able to see it. Thank you very much.
No, there's going to be audio.